The clock reads 0317 local time when the first tremor rolls through the Iranian plateau. Not an earthquake, not a storm front pushing in from the Caspian. Something far more deliberate, far more consequential. Deep beneath the Alborz mountain range, inside hardened launch complexes that Western intelligence agencies had spent years trying to locate technicians in olive green uniforms complete their final pre-launch sequences. Screens glow, targeting coordinates lock. Authorization codes cascade down a chain of command that runs from the Supreme Leader's War Council directly into the gloved hands of the men standing at those consoles. 690 Fattah-2 hypersonic ballistic missiles sit in their vertical launch tubes, pointed skyward, waiting. At 0322, the order comes. The ground shakes, the sky tears open, and the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow, irreplaceable artery through which 40% of the world's seaborne oil flows, becomes the most dangerous 18 miles of water on the planet. Within the next 4 hours, 6 United States Navy destroyers will lie on the floor of the Persian Gulf. 7,200 American sailors will be stranded, some in lifeboats, some clinging to burning wreckage, some waiting in silence on vessels too damaged to move and too exposed to survive another strike. The USS Fifth Fleet, the most powerful naval forward deployment in American history, will have ceased to function as a coherent fighting force. And in Washington, D.C., in the Situation Room, in the halls of the Pentagon, in the offices of the National Security Council, the people who built that fleet, who funded it, who told the American public it was invincible, will be trying to explain how this happened. This is that story. Before we go further, if you've been watching this channel for any length of time, you already know that what mainstream media gives you about Iran's military capability is at best incomplete and at worst deliberately misleading. We don't do that here. We go deep. We go technical. We follow the strategic logic wherever it leads, regardless of which narrative it challenges. If that's the kind of analysis you're looking for, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Every video we publish is built on open source intelligence, military doctrine, and geopolitical context that most channels won't touch. You're here because you want the full picture. Let's give it to you. Here's what we're going to cover in this video. First, what actually happened in the Strait of Hormuz during those 4 hours? How did Iranian strike planners execute a 690 missile salvo against a dispersed naval formation? And why did the US Navy's layered air defense system fail to stop it? Second, what is the Fattah-2 really? Not the sanitized version you've seen in Western press briefings, but the actual weapon system, its guidance architecture, its terminal velocity, its warhead design, and why it represents generational leap beyond anything Iran has previously fielded. Third, what does the stranding of 7,200 American sailors mean for US force posture in the Middle East? And how is Washington responding to a crisis it publicly claimed was impossible? And fourth, what does this moment tell us about the deeper structural shift underway in the global order? Because what happened in the Persian Gulf isn't just a military event, it's a signal. And the world is receiving it loud and clear. Stay with us. To understand what happened on the morning of the strike, you need to understand what the United States Navy was doing in the Persian Gulf in the weeks leading up to it. Following a series of escalating exchanges between Iranian proxy forces and American installations across Iraq and Syria, the Pentagon made a decision that has since been described by several anonymous officials as a demonstration of resolve. The USS Fifth Fleet, already the permanent U.S. Naval Command for the region, was reinforced. 2 additional destroyer groups were rotated into the Gulf. The aircraft carrier USS Dwight D. Eisenhower was repositioned closer to the strait. American naval assets in the region reached their highest concentration in years. The message Washington intended to send was clear. The United States was not backing down. Its naval presence in the Gulf was a deterrent, a warning, a reminder of American power. Iranian strategists read that message differently. Where American planners saw a show of force, Iranian military planners saw a targeting opportunity. 6 destroyers, multiple support vessels, all operating within the operational range of Iran's land-based missile arsenal. All concentrated in waters where Iranian surveillance satellite drone human intelligence had been tracking their positions continuously for weeks. Iran's Integrated Strike Command had been running simulations of exactly this scenario for years. Not hypothetically, operationally. With specific vessels, specific coordinates, specific strike packages tailored to defeat the specific layered air defense systems those vessels carried. When the order came down, it wasn't improvised. It was executed. The 690 missile salvo was not fired from a single location. That is the first and most important tactical point to understand. Iranian missile forces used a distributed launch architecture, a doctrine that has been central to Iran's anti-access area denial strategy for over a decade. Launch sites were positioned across multiple provinces, hardened underground complexes in Tehran province, mobile transporter erector launchers deployed across Fars province to the south, additional fixed sites in Hormozgan province along the northern Gulf coastline. This distribution served two purposes. First, it made preemptive targeting by US forces geometrically complicated. No single strike or even series of strikes could neutralize all launch capability simultaneously. Second, it created a multi-axis threat envelope for the American destroyers. Missiles were not arriving from one direction. They were arriving from multiple vectors simultaneously, forcing the destroyers' radar and fire control systems to track and engage threats coming from fundamentally different approach angles at the same time. The salvo was organized in waves. An initial volley of shorter-range ballistic missiles Zulfiqar variants was launched first time to arrive approximately 90 seconds before the main Fattah-2 packages. These initial missiles served a specific purpose. They were designed to force the destroyer's Aegis combat systems into active engagement mode, expending interceptors, generating electronic signatures, and revealing the precise positioning of each vessel's radar arrays. By the time the Fattah-2 missiles reached their terminal descent phase, the destroyer's air defense systems were already partially depleted and fully occupied. American naval doctrine for the Persian Gulf relies on what strategists call layered air defense, a series of concentric defensive rings, each designed to intercept incoming threats at progressively closer ranges. At the outer layer, E-2D Hawkeye aircraft provide airborne early warning and cueing. At the middle layer, SM-3 interceptors launched from Aegis destroyers are designed to engage ballistic missiles in their mid-course phase. At the inner layer, SM-2 and ESSM missiles engage surviving threats in the terminal phase. And as a final backstop, the Phalanx close-in weapon system, a radar-guided rotary cannon, engages anything that gets through everything else. Against conventional ballistic missiles, this architecture has performed reasonably well in tests and in limited real-world engagements. Against hypersonic glide vehicles operating at the velocities and terminal maneuver profiles of the Fattah-2, it encountered a problem that American defense planners had acknowledged theoretically but had not solved operationally. Time at Mach 15 terminal velocity, a Fattah-2 inches, its final descent phase covers the last 10 kilometers of its trajectory in approximately 2 seconds. The SM-3's engagement envelope assumes a target following a predictable ballistic arc. The Fattah-2 does not follow a predictable arc. Its maneuvering re-entry vehicle executes lateral corrections in the terminal phase, not large corrections, but corrections sufficient to defeat a fire control solution calculated even half a second earlier. The Aegis systems on the destroyers were not blind. They detected the incoming missiles. They launched interceptors. Some of those interceptors scored hits. But the mathematics of 690 incoming missiles against a finite interceptor inventory, combined with the degraded engagement geometry created by the initial Zulfiqar volley, produced an outcome that the system's designers had hoped to avoid. Saturation, penetration, impact. The first destroyer took a direct hit at 0341. The Fattah-2 that struck it impacted amidships at an angle calculated to maximize structural damage below the waterline. The warhead, a semi-armor-piercing design, penetrated the hull before detonation. The explosion occurred inside the vessel. Naval architects design destroyers to survive a great deal. They are not designed to survive an internal detonation from a hypersonic warhead delivering kinetic energy equivalent to a small tactical strike. The ship listed immediately and began taking water through the breach. Over the next 90 minutes, 5 more destroyers suffered catastrophic hits. The pattern was consistent. Multiple impacts per vessel targeted at propulsion systems, combat information centers, and below waterline hull sections. Iranian strike planners had clearly studied the structural vulnerabilities of the Ali Burt class in considerable detail. By 0500 local time, all 6 destroyers had either sunk or were taking on water fast enough that their commanding officers had ordered abandoned ship. 7,200 sailors were in the water, in life rafts, or on critically damaged vessels that were themselves under threat of secondary strikes. The Fattah-2 did not appear from nowhere. Its development is the culmination of a missile program that Iran has been running largely in secret for the better part of 3 decades. Western analysts who dismissed Iran's early missile efforts as crude copies of North Korean and Chinese designs were not entirely wrong. Those early systems were derivative. But they missed the trajectory. Iran was not trying to replicate 1980s missile technology. It was building the industrial base, the engineering expertise, and the indigenous supply chain that would eventually allow it to develop systems of its own design. The Fattah, the name means conqueror in Arabic, was publicly unveiled by Iran in 2023. Western analysts at the time offered cautious assessments. Yes, it appeared to be a genuine hypersonic glide vehicle, but its actual performance characteristics were unknown. The Fattah-2, the upgraded variant, was subsequently disclosed with claimed improvements to range maneuverability and guidance precision. What happened in the Strait of Hormuz was, among other things, a live operational test of those claims. The results speak for themselves. The Fattah-2 is classified as a hypersonic ballistic missile with a maneuvering re-entry vehicle. This classification is important because it distinguishes it from two other categories of hypersonic weapons: hypersonic glide vehicles launched from rocket boosters and air-breathing hypersonic cruise missiles, each of which presents different defensive challenges. The Fattah-2's boost phase uses a solid fuel rocket motor. Solid fuel is critical for a weapon intended for rapid deployment, unlike liquid-fueled missiles, which require fueling immediately before launch and are therefore visible to surveillance assets during pre-launch preparation. A solid-fueled missile can sit in its launch tube, indefinitely ready to fire with minimal preparation time. The window between the decision to launch and the actual launch of the Fattah-2 is measured in minutes, not hours. The missile's mid-course phase follows a semi-ballistic trajectory that takes it to altitudes above the effective engagement envelope of most theater missile defense systems. This is deliberate. At high altitude, the missile is technically within range of SM-3 interceptors, but the geometry of an intercept at those altitudes is complex, and the Fattah-2's trajectory during this phase is not the smooth, predictable arc of an older ballistic missile. The re-entry vehicle separates from the boost stage and transitions to a glide phase in the upper atmosphere. During this glide phase, which can cover considerable horizontal distance, the vehicle maintains a degree of maneuverability that allows it to adjust its approach vector to the target. This maneuverability is the key attribute that makes the system so difficult to engage defensively. A fire control system predicting the missile's impact point based on its observed trajectory will generate a solution that the missile can render obsolete with a relatively small lateral correction. At terminal phase, the vehicle pitches down toward its target at velocities that have been estimated at between Mach 13 and Mach 15. At these speeds, the aerodynamic heating of the vehicle's leading edges generates a plasma sheath, a layer of ionized gas that, depending on its density and the frequencies involved, can interfere with radar tracking from ground-based or shipborne systems attempting to maintain a fire control solution. The warhead design appears tailored specifically for naval targets. Semi-armor-piercing configuration, delayed fuse to allow hull penetration before detonation shaped to maximize below-waterline damage. One of the most significant strategic questions raised by the strike is how Iran assembled and maintained an inventory of 690 Fattah-2 missiles without that stockpile being detected and targeted by Western or Israeli intelligence. The answer involves several factors that analysts are now revisiting with considerable urgency. Iran's underground tunnel network, referred to internally as the Missile Cities program, is far more extensive than previously acknowledged in public assessments. Hardened tunnels, some bored directly into mountain rock, provide storage and launch capability that is largely invisible to overhead surveillance. The depth of some of these facilities places them below the effective penetration depth of all but the most specialized bunker-busting munitions. Iran has also invested heavily in deception and concealment operations, decoy facilities, false storage locations, deliberate management of electronic signatures to mask real activity. These are not improvised countermeasures. They are components of a systematic program to deny Western intelligence agencies the ability to build an accurate picture of Iranian missile inventory. The result, when the strike came, the United States could not know that Iran had 690 Fattah-2s ready to fire. And that intelligence failure had consequences that 7200 stranded sailors were now experiencing directly. There is a broader point here that goes beyond the specifications of a single weapon system. For decades, American naval superiority in the Persian Gulf, and by extension, American strategic dominance of the broader Middle East, rested on a foundational assumption that U.S. Navy surface combatants protected by layered air defense systems could operate in the Gulf with acceptable risk. This assumption was the basis for basing decisions, deployment patterns, and political commitments. It was the foundation on which American power projection in the region was built. The Fattah-2 has cracked that foundation, not destroyed it. The U.S. Navy remains the most powerful maritime force on the planet, and American military capability across all domains continues to exceed Iran's by enormous margins. But the specific assumption that American destroyers in the Persian Gulf were adequately protected against Iranian missile attack has been operationally tested, and it failed. That failure will reverberate through American defense planning for years. The first confirmed reports of the strike reached the National Security Council in the early hours of the morning Washington time. The initial accounts were fragmentary radar tracks, distress signals, communications from surviving vessels, satellite imagery showing thermal signatures in the Gulf consistent with burning ships. Within 90 minutes, the picture had clarified enough to produce a preliminary assessment: multiple U.S. destroyers sunk or critically damaged, mass casualty event underway. Iranian missile forces believed to have conducted a coordinated, large-scale strike. The reaction inside the Situation Room, according to accounts from officials who have since spoken to journalists on background, was not the calm, structured crisis management that American national security culture projects in public. It was something considerably messier. There was confusion about the scale of the attack. There was disagreement about the initial response options. There was a profound institutional shock at the realization that the scenario being described, the one that contingency planners had gamed out in classified exercises, but that was widely considered too escalatory for Iran to attempt, had actually occurred. The president was briefed. The Joint Chiefs were convened. The Secretary of Defense placed calls to allied defense ministers. And in the Pentagon's E-ring officers, who had spent careers building and defending the naval posture that had just been shattered, began the grim process of accounting for what had been lost. One of the most uncomfortable realities that emerged from the initial damage assessment was the interceptor expenditure rate during the engagement. The destroyers that engaged incoming Fattah-2 missiles had expended a significant portion of their SM-3 and SM-6 interceptor inventory in the engagement. Some vessels had run through their entire defensive interceptor load before the attack concluded. This created an immediate operational problem. The surviving American naval assets in the Gulf, including the carrier strike group, were now partially or significantly depleted in their primary defensive munitions. Resupply of those munitions is not a rapid process. SM-3 interceptors are not stockpiled in large quantities in forward locations. They are produced at a limited rate, they are expensive, and they are not the kind of ordnance that a combatant commander can requisition and receive within days. The practical implication: the remaining U.S. naval assets in the Gulf were, for a period measured in days to weeks, operating with degraded defensive capability against the threat system that had just demonstrated its ability to defeat that capability, even at full strength. Pentagon planners understood what this meant. So did Iranian strategists. While the strategic debate raged in Washington, a more immediate and human crisis was unfolding in the waters of the Persian Gulf. 7,200 American sailors, men and women ranging from senior officers to junior enlisted personnel who had been weeks into their first deployment, were stranded across an enormous area of open water. Some were in organized life raft clusters. Some were on damaged vessels that were slowly losing their battle against flooding. Some were simply in the water. The rescue operation that the U.S. military mounted was by any measure a massive undertaking. Helicopters from surviving ships and from land bases in Bahrain and Qatar were tasked immediately. Coast Guard and naval assets were redirected from across the region. Allied navies, British, French, Emirati, contributed vessels and aircraft. But the Persian Gulf is a constrained operational environment, and Iranian forces, whatever their next operational intentions, remained fully capable of striking again. Every rescue asset operating in the Gulf was operating under the threat of a follow-on attack. Commanders had to weigh the humanitarian imperative of pulling sailors from the water against the military reality that their rescue platforms were themselves potential targets. The casualty figures that emerged from the operation over the following days were stark. Of the 7,200 sailors stranded, the majority were eventually recovered. But the numbers of dead and wounded from the initial impacts, from fires, from ships sinking faster than crews could abandon them, represented the largest single incident loss of American military lives in the region in generations. The political consequences in Washington moved at a speed that surprised even experienced observers of the American political system. Within 48 hours of the strike, congressional leaders from both parties were demanding classified briefings on the intelligence failures that had allowed Iran to build and deploy a 690 missile hypersonic capability without adequate warning. The questions being asked in those briefings about collection gaps, about analytical failures, about the institutional tendency to underestimate Iranian military capability were questions that the intelligence community did not have comfortable answers to. The broader political question, what does the United States do now, produced a debate that exposed deep fractures in American strategic thinking about the Middle East. Hawks called for immediate and overwhelming retaliation. Realists argued that escalation carried risks that the American public had not been prepared for and that American military planners had not fully gamed out. And a growing contingent of voices, some of them surprising in their institutional pedigree, began to ask a more fundamental question. What is the United States trying to achieve in the Persian Gulf? And is the cost of achieving it now starkly visible in the form of thousands of sailors lost one that the American people are willing to pay? Those questions did not have quick answers. And the absence of quick answers in Washington produced exactly the thing that Iran's strategic planners had arguably hoped to generate: visible, public, politically significant American hesitation. To understand what happened in the Persian Gulf, you cannot separate the military event from the political decision that produced it. Iran did not stumble into this strike. It did not miscalculate, did not misread. American signals did not accidentally launch 690 missiles against a US naval formation. The decision to execute this strike was made deliberately at the highest levels of the Iranian state, after a strategic calculation that whatever consequences followed the continuation of the status quo American naval forces operating freely in waters Iran considers its strategic backyard. American pressure on Iranian economics and politics, American support for Israeli military operations was more intolerable than the risks of confrontation. That calculation reflects something important about the nature of the Iranian state and the revolutionary ideology that has animated it since 1979. The Islamic Republic of Iran has survived 40-plus years of extraordinary external pressure, economic sanctions that have cost the Iranian economy hundreds of billions of dollars, covert operations targeting its nuclear program, assassinations of its scientists and military commanders, the killing of General Qasem Soleimani on Iraqi soil, a sustained campaign by Israel and the United States to degrade Iranian proxy networks across the region. Through all of this, the Islamic Republic has not collapsed. It has not moderated into strategic passivity. It has, in important ways, grown harder and more capable. The Fattah-2 itself is evidence of that. And Iran, under maximum pressure, found the resources, the human capital, and the institutional will to develop and produce a world-class hypersonic missile system. The strategic lesson that Iranian planners have drawn from their own experience is not that caution pays. It is that patience, internal resilience, and the willingness to absorb and return pain are the attributes that allow a state to survive and ultimately prevail against a stronger adversary. Western strategic analysis often struggles with the Iranian concept of resistance, the idea rooted in Shia Islamic theology and refined through decades of revolutionary politics that sacrifice in defense of the nation and the faith is not merely acceptable, but sacred. This is not to say that Iranian leaders are irrational or indifferent to the material costs of their decisions. The Iranian government is composed of sophisticated political actors who understand power, interests, and consequences. But their risk calculus includes variables that do not appear in Western strategic models specifically. A genuine ideological commitment to resistance that makes certain forms of accommodation politically and theologically unacceptable regardless of their material cost. When Iranian state media described the Hormuz strike as an act of legitimate defense against American aggression, that framing was not purely propaganda. It reflected a genuine reading of the situation widely shared within Iran's political and military establishment, in which the presence of American destroyers in the Gulf was itself an act of coercion that Iran had both the right, the obligation to confront. This ideological dimension has practical strategic consequences. It means that the coercive logic that underlies American deterrent strategy, the idea that by raising the costs of Iranian action sufficiently high, you can deter that action, has real limitations when applied to an actor for whom the costs of inaction are themselves experienced as existential. Whatever the divisions within Iranian society about the Islamic Republic's domestic policies, the strike on American destroyers in the Persian Gulf produced something approaching national consensus. Footage broadcast on Iranian state television showed crowds in Tehran and other major cities celebrating. These celebrations were not entirely manufactured by state media. The genuine popular sentiment was visible in the social media content originating from Iran in the hours and days after the strike. For many Iranians, regardless of their views on their government, watching Iranian missiles sink American warships in waters adjacent to their country was experienced as a profound moment of national vindication. Decades of economic pressure, of being told by the world's dominant power that Iran must change its behavior or face consequences, of watching Israeli strikes on Iranian-affiliated targets proceed with American acquiescence, all of that history compressed into the image of American destroyers listing and burning in the Persian Gulf. The domestic political effect of the strike was to consolidate support for the Islamic Republic's strategic posture in a way that no number of ideological campaigns could have achieved. The argument that resistance pays that Iran's investment in military capability and its refusal to accept subordination were vindicated was now supported by visible, undeniable evidence. The strike in the Strait of Hormuz was, on one level, a military event between Iran and the United States. On another level, it was a global communication, a signal transmitted simultaneously to every government on the planet that was watching how the post-Cold War international order was functioning. And every significant power on the planet was watching. In Moscow, the assessment of what happened in the Persian Gulf was processed through the lens of Russia's own confrontation with American power in Ukraine. Russian strategic planners had long argued that the United States was overextended, that its military dominance was more brittle than its reputation suggested, and that a sufficiently determined and well-equipped adversary could impose costs that American domestic politics would find difficult to absorb. The Hormuz strike was, from Moscow's perspective, a data point supporting those arguments. In Beijing, Chinese analysts were drawing more specific conclusions. The People's Liberation Army has spent 2 decades building a military posture explicitly designed to challenge American naval dominance in the Western Pacific, a posture that relies heavily on land-based ballistic and hypersonic missiles targeting American surface combatants. The Fattah-2's performance against American destroyers in the Gulf was, for Chinese military planners, essentially a live-fire test of the strategic concept underlying their own anti-access area denial doctrine. And the test had produced results broadly consistent with their models. In Riyadh, in Abu Dhabi, in Ankara, in New Delhi, governments that had structured their security relationships around the assumption of persistent American naval dominance in the Gulf and the broader Indo-Pacific were reassessing. Not abandoning their relationships with Washington, American power remained enormous across multiple dimensions, but recalibrating their understanding of what that power could and could not guarantee. For the better part of 3 decades since the end of the Cold War, American naval supremacy has functioned as something close to a global public good, or at least a global strategic fact. The ability of U.S. Navy surface combatants to operate in any ocean on Earth, to project power from the sea, to control the maritime commons, was the physical foundation of the American-led international order. It was what gave American security guarantees their credibility. It was what made American threats credible and American promises meaningful. That era is not over, but its unchallenged dominance is. What the Hormuz strike demonstrated is that a regional power, not a peer competitor like China or Russia, but a middle power with a large motivated military and decades of investment in asymmetric capabilities, can impose catastrophic losses on American surface naval forces in a constrained maritime environment. If Iran can do this in the Persian Gulf, the implications for other constrained maritime environments, the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, the Baltic, are not lost on the military planners of the states that would be the adversaries in those scenarios. The response from American allies in the Gulf region was characteristically public solidarity and private alarm. Public statements from Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia expressed condemnation of the Iranian strike. Private diplomatic communications, as subsequently reported, reflected deep anxiety about the security architecture that those states had depended on for their own protection. If American destroyers could be sunk in the Gulf, what exactly was the security guarantee worth? One dimension of the Hormuz strike that received relatively less attention in American media, but considerable attention in strategic analysis circles, was the question of what role, if any, Russian and Chinese technical assistance played in the Fattah-2's demonstrated performance. The question is not whether Iran developed its hypersonic missile program with some form of technical input from Moscow or Beijing. That has been an open subject of discussion in the arms control and non-proliferation communities for years. And the answer is almost certainly that some form of knowledge transfer occurred, though its precise nature and extent remain matters of dispute. The question is whether that transfer was recent enough and specific enough to have contributed to the capabilities demonstrated in the Hormuz strike. Iranian officials have consistently maintained that the Fattah program is entirely indigenous, a product of Iranian engineering talent and industrial capability. Russian and Chinese officials have denied providing prohibited military assistance to Iran. Neither claim is necessarily false. The lines between legitimate commercial technology, dual-use industrial equipment, and direct military assistance are not always clear. And states that want to transfer capability without the legal and political costs of doing so openly have many tools available to them. What is clear is that the strategic interests of Iran, Russia, and China in challenging American dominance in the Gulf and the broader Middle East are substantially aligned. All three states benefit from a world in which American power is visibly constrained, in which American allies have reason to doubt American security guarantees, and in which the rules-based international order that the United States has championed since 1945 is revealed to depend on military power that is not as dominant as advertised. The Hormuz strike served those interests regardless of whether Moscow and Beijing were directly involved in making it happen. The question that every analyst, every diplomat, every military planner was asking in the days after the strike was simple. What happens now? The United States faced a strategic choice with no good options. Escalation, direct military strikes on Iranian territory, including the missile production facilities and launch sites that had executed the strike, carried enormous risks. Iran had demonstrated that it could inflict catastrophic losses on American surface forces. A direct attack on Iranian territory would almost certainly produce a response, and the potential targets for that response: American bases in the Gulf, the Saudi and Emirati oil infrastructure, that American economic and political relationships depend on Israeli population centers, global shipping through the Strait of Hormuz itself were numerous and in many cases difficult to defend. De-escalation, backing down from the confrontational posture that had preceded the strike, withdrawing naval assets, entering negotiations, was politically almost impossible for any American administration. The optics of American destroyers on the bottom of the Persian Gulf and 7,000 sailors stranded in the water made any outcome that could be characterized as a retreat politically toxic. What remained was the middle ground, a combination of selective retaliatory strikes designed to signal resolve without triggering a full-scale war, combined with a quiet diplomatic process aimed at establishing some form of understanding about what each side's red lines actually were. Whether that middle path was achievable, whether Iranian and American strategic cultures, political systems, and domestic pressures would allow both sides to pull back from the edge, was the question that the next weeks and months would answer. What was already clear in the immediate aftermath of the Hormuz strike was that the Middle East that existed before those 690 missiles launched was gone. The strategic landscape had changed in ways that would take years to fully understand. 6 destroyers on the floor of the Persian Gulf, 7,200 American sailors stranded in the water, an intelligence community with profound questions to answer about what it missed and why. A political establishment in Washington trying to explain to the American people how a scenario it had called impossible had happened on live satellite imagery. And in Tehran, in the command centers where those 690 Fattah-2 missiles were launched, a strategic calculation that had been building for decades that Iran could not wait for the confrontation to come to it on American terms. That resistance required demonstration, that sovereignty had to be defended with something more than words had been acted on, with consequences that the entire world was still processing. This is the moment we are in. A moment where the gap between the official narrative about American military dominance and the operational reality of what land-based hypersonic missiles can do to surface naval forces in constrained maritime environments has been closed not by academic analysis, not by war games, but by the thing itself. By the actual event. The analysts who told you Iran was too weak, too rational, too dependent on the existing order to ever do something like this were wrong. The assumption embedded in American force posture in the Gulf that the presence of destroyers was a deterrent rather than a target set was wrong. Being wrong at this scale has consequences, not just for the sailors who paid the price for those errors in judgment, for the entire architecture of American power in the Middle East and beyond. If you want to keep following how this develops, the retaliatory calculations, the diplomatic maneuvering, the longer-term reshaping of Gulf security architecture, this channel is where we will be covering it. Every development, every strategic implication, without the filter of official narratives that have already been proven wrong. Subscribe if you haven't. Share this video with anyone trying to understand what is actually happening in the Middle East right now. And leave your analysis in the comments. The conversation in this community is one of the most serious and informed I've encountered, and your perspective matters. We'll see you in the next video.